Ilara Myant walked into her wedding in London draped in silk and secrets, while Callum Havers stood beside her unaware that humiliation and rage would soon turn him into a killer. Vivian Havers sharpened her plan to expose the bride's forged past, and Dr. Isolde Crane carried the evidence that would transform a celebration into a crime scene, leaving Detective Rowan Pike to unravel how a marriage meant to unite two worlds ended in blood. The grand day arrived with an air of splendor that could almost disguise the tension lurking beneath its polished surface. Ilara Myant, a young woman from Malaysia, stepped into the gilded ballroom of a historic London hotel, dressed in a flowing silk gown that shimmered like liquid ivory under the chandeliers. Her veil, embroidered with delicate gold threads, framed her serene expression, though inside her chest, her heart hammered relentlessly. She had come so far, carrying with her not only the hope of a new life, but also a secret that, if exposed, could tear everything apart. Her marriage to Callum Havers was meant to cement ties between two worlds, the rich traditions of Malaysia, and the strict societal expectations of the Havers family in London. Guests from across continents gathered in glittering attire, speaking in hushed tones of admiration for the young bride, believing they were witnessing the union of love, culture, and legacy. From the outside, Ilara's journey seemed like a fairy tale. She had been chosen by Callum, the son of a prominent business family whose reputation stretched across financial districts in London and beyond. He was admired for his ambition and wealth, and to those watching he seemed to embody the perfect groom. His family, however, carried an air of cold formality, always maintaining appearances and ensuring that their social standing remained untarnished. For them, Ilara was less of a woman and more of a symbol, a bride who needed to be flawless, pure, and capable of upholding the values that they projected to the world. Yet what none of the guests knew was that, before this union could be accepted, Ilara had been forced to undergo a degrading demand by the Havers family, proof of her virginity. It was a tradition rooted not in modern love but in outdated notions of honor and control. Ilara, terrified of being rejected, had searched for a way out of this cruel scrutiny. In Malaysia, she had visited a clinic notorious for providing counterfeit medical documents. With trembling hands, she had secured a forged certificate that declared her untouched, hoping this piece of paper would silence suspicions and win her passage into the Havers family's rigid world. As she walked down the aisle that day, the heavy silence of expectation pressed against her shoulders. Callum stood tall in his tailored suit, smiling faintly as the music swelled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Perhaps he sensed the weight of the family's demands on his bride, or perhaps he felt the strain of his sister Vivian's sharp gaze from the front row. Vivian had never trusted Ilara, and even on this day her narrowed eyes followed every step the bride took. As though waiting for the first crack in the illusion, the ballroom itself was a vision of excess. White roses spilled from golden vases. Mirrored walls reflected candlelight like shards of fire, and the air was thick with perfume and anticipation. The union of Ilara and Callum was not just a private celebration. It was a performance for hundreds of witnesses, many of whom whispered quietly about the wealth, the grandeur, and the traditions wrapped into this single day. For Ilara, each smile she offered was forced, each step rehearsed, each breath measured against the fear that someone might already know her secret. When the vows began, the words carried an almost theatrical quality. Ilara's voice trembled only slightly as she repeated the promises expected of her. Callum's tone was confident but rigid, as though duty overshadowed warmth. To the onlookers, the moment was enchanting, a union sealed in elegance and honor. But for Ilara, the vows were chains, binding her tighter into a life built on deception. She could feel the weight of the forged certificate tucked away in her luggage, hidden yet powerful enough to determine her entire future after the ceremony. When applause echoed off marble walls and guests lifted glasses of champagne, Ilara smiled for the cameras. Every photograph captured her as the radiant bride, but none revealed the shadows behind her eyes. She thought of the night she had signed her name on the forged papers, the fear of discovery gnawing at her even now. She told herself the worst was behind her, that the ceremony had been completed and her secret was safe. Yet deep down, she could not shake the dread that hovered in the corners of her mind, what she did not know, as she lingered beside Callum for the endless procession of photographs, was that her secret had already begun to unravel. In the crowded ballroom, among the guests and the flicker of chandeliers, someone else carried knowledge that would soon pierce the veil of her carefully constructed lie. What appeared to be a celebration of love and unity was, in truth, the opening act of a tragedy waiting to erupt. Vivian Havers had always been the kind of woman who noticed the smallest cracks in people's stories. From the moment Callum introduced Alara to the family, Vivian's instincts told her something wasn't right. She smiled politely at dinners, complimented Alara's dress choices, and pretended to welcome her into their circle. But beneath her calm exterior lay suspicion that grew sharper with each passing day. Vivian was fiercely protective of her brother's reputation, not out of love but out of a desire to keep the Havers' name unsullied. To her, Alara was an outsider who appeared too polished, too careful, as though she were hiding something that could, one day, embarrass them all. The virginity certificate had been a central issue for the Havers family. They prided themselves on tradition, often using outdated rituals as a measure of worth. When Alara presented the document she had brought from Malaysia, Callum seemed satisfied, but Vivian was not. She studied the paper closely, her sharp eyes catching details that most people would ignore: the unusual font of the letterhead, the signature that looked like it had been traced rather than signed, and the fact that the certificate came from a clinic she had never heard of. Something about it gnawed at her, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became to find the truth. Behind closed doors, Vivian made her move. She contacted a discreet investigator she had worked with in the past, a woman named Dr. Isolde Crane. Dr. Crane was not just a physician, but someone who specialized in private verifications for wealthy families, who demanded certainty before alliances were sealed. Her services were expensive and quiet, the kind of work that existed only in whispers. Vivian arranged a meeting and handed over a copy of Alara's certificate. The doctor promised to look into its origins, tracing every detail to confirm whether the document was genuine. For days leading up to the wedding, Alara remained blissfully unaware of the trap tightening around her. She focused on fittings, rehearsals, and ceremonial practices, believing her forged document had secured her place. Meanwhile, Vivian waited impatiently for Dr. Crane's findings, her resentment building like pressure behind a locked door. She couldn't bear the thought of her family name being tied to deception. Nor could she stand the possibility that Alara might outshine her in London society once she became Callum's wife. The report arrived just hours before the ceremony. Dr. Crane's voice was steady but grave as she delivered the results. The certificate was a forgery. The clinic in Malaysia had long been suspected of providing counterfeit medical documents for money, and the signature on Alara's paper belonged not to a doctor, but to a low-level clerk. To make matters worse, the forgery had been sloppily done, riddled with inconsistencies that would have been obvious to anyone who looked closely. Vivian's suspicions had been confirmed beyond doubt. Holding the report in her hands, Vivian felt a wave of vindication mixed with a dangerous thrill. She now had the weapon she needed to destroy Alara's carefully crafted image. But she did not rush to Callum with the evidence. Instead, she carefully planned how to use it. She wanted the revelation to sting, not just for Alara but for everyone in attendance. Public humiliation would ensure that Alara was not only rejected but also remembered as a fraud by every influential guest present at the wedding. Vivian's mind twisted around the idea of exposure, imagining the gasps of the crowd, the collapse of Alara's composure, and the shame that would ripple across both families. As the wedding unfolded in glittering perfection, Vivian stood among the guests with the secret burning in her pocket. She smiled at the bride, offered polite toasts, and blended seamlessly into the celebration, but her thoughts were consumed by the moment she would strike. To her, Alara was a liar who had tricked her way into privilege, and justice meant unveiling that lie in front of all who had been fooled. What Vivian failed to see was the danger of her own obsession. By choosing to expose the secret in such a public way, She was lighting a fuse that would lead to something far darker than humiliation. While Ilara clung to her new husband's arm and basked in fleeting relief, Vivian's plans simmered in silence. The truth had been discovered, the deception laid bare, and only the timing of its release remained. In her quest to protect her family's pride, Vivian did not realize she had already set events into motion that would end in blood. The forged paper had crossed oceans, but now, in London's glittering halls, it would soon deliver devastation. The vows had been spoken, the rings exchanged, and the kiss sealed beneath a canopy of lights. Applause echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off mirrored walls and marble columns. For a fleeting moment, Ilara Mayant allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was behind her. She had walked down the aisle, spoken her promises, and stood as Callum's wife before the hundreds of guests gathered. To the world watching, she looked every inch the perfect bride, her eyes glowing beneath her delicate veil, her smile soft and radiant. Cameras flashed endlessly, capturing every angle of the moment that was meant to define her future. Yet beneath the glitter of celebration, the unease in her chest remained. A pulse of dread that refused to be silenced. As the couple walked into the grand reception hall hand in hand, the scale of the spectacle became clear. The tables were draped in velvet, lined with silverware that sparkled under golden chandeliers. Musicians played softly in the background, and waiters moved swiftly with trays of champagne. Guests from Malaysia mingled with London's elite, exchanging greetings in a blur of accents and traditions. To all appearances, it was a celebration of unity across cultures, a union that symbolized prosperity and status. But the joy that filled the air was thin, fragile, easily broken by the whisper of a rumor. At the head table, Callum sat upright, his posture as flawless as his tailored suit. Yet his demeanor carried a stiffness that unsettled Ilara. He smiled when expected, raised his glass when prompted. But his eyes wandered, distant and distracted. Ilara noticed the shift but tried to dismiss it as nerves. She told herself it was normal for a man under such pressure to appear detached. What she did not see was the storm that had already begun to swirl just beyond her reach. Vivian Havers, seated close to the stage, could barely hide her anticipation. She had spent the hours before the ceremony orchestrating her plan with ruthless precision. The forged certificate had been traced, the evidence gathered, and now she was ready to strike. She had already made a call to a trusted contact who could ensure the information would not remain hidden. Within minutes of the reception starting, anonymous accounts began sharing whispers online, spreading the truth about Ilara's false document. What started as a small spark of gossip among a few guests quickly grew into a fire that swept through the hall. The first hints reached Callum's closest friends. They leaned toward one another with furrowed brows, scrolling through their phones under the table. The words "forged certificate" appeared in hushed tones, shared in nervous glances and hurried messages. Soon, the whispers moved from table to table, subtle at first, then louder as confidence grew. Ilara felt it even before she heard it. The way guests' eyes flickered toward her, the half-hidden smirks, the silence that spread when she passed. Something had shifted in the room, and though the music still played and glasses still clinked, the air was heavy with suspicion. Callum grew noticeably tense as the evening progressed. His glass remained untouched, his jaw clenched tighter with every passing minute. When a trusted cousin leaned toward him and muttered something under his breath, Callum's expression hardened. Ilara, watching from his side, felt her pulse quicken. She could not hear the words, but she understood the look. The secret she had worked so hard to bury was clawing its way to the surface. Across the hall, Vivian observed with quiet satisfaction. Her timing was deliberate, her patience exact. She wanted Ilara to feel the weight of exposure, to sense the walls closing in before the final blow was delivered. To Vivian, this was justice, a public unveiling of deceit wrapped in the spectacle of a wedding. Yet she failed to see the rage brewing in her brother's silence. The fury that humiliation was already feeding inside him. Ilara tried to steady herself, to smile for the photographs, to sip her drink as though nothing was wrong. But every second felt longer, every shadow heavier. She could sense that the celebration around her was collapsing, though no one had yet dared to confront her directly. The ballroom glittered, but beneath the polished surface, Tension curled like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. By the time dessert was served, the whispers had grown into an open current of speculation. The bride's secret was no longer safe, and though the music carried on, the reception had already turned cold. The storm was coming, and Ilara, trapped in her gown and surrounded by watching eyes, knew she could not escape what was about to unfold. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from unease to chaos in a matter of seconds. Dessert plates had barely touched the tables when Vivian made her move. She rose from her seat, her presence commanding attention even without a microphone. By her side stood Dr. Isolde Crane, her expression grim, her hands clutching a file that contained the evidence. Guests turned, curious, as silence spread like a ripple through water. In an instant, the joyful hum of music and laughter evaporated, replaced by a collective tension that tightened every breath. Vivian's voice, steady and cold, cut through the silence as she announced what she had discovered. She revealed that Ilara's virginity certificate was a forgery, obtained from a fraudulent clinic in Malaysia, known for producing false documents. Dr. Crane confirmed the findings with professional authority, citing the inconsistencies and forged signatures. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed, chairs scraped, and phones were pulled out to verify the scandal already spreading online. Ilara stood frozen, her face pale beneath the layers of makeup, her carefully constructed facade collapsing in front of hundreds of watching eyes. For Callum Havers, the moment shattered something deep inside. His family's pride, his personal honor, and the perfection he believed he had secured all dissolved in one humiliating strike. He looked at Ilara not as his new wife but as the embodiment of betrayal, a woman who had fooled him, fooled his family, and allowed him to stand in front of society as a man deceived. The weight of humiliation pressed harder with every whisper, every stare, every recording phone capturing his disgrace. Rage, raw and uncontrollable, began to replace the shock. In a haze of fury, Callum left the head table without a word. Guests assumed he was retreating in shame, but moments later he returned carrying an ornate ceremonial dagger. It was a piece that had been part of the Havers family's heritage, displayed behind glass in the ballroom as a symbol of legacy. Now it gleamed in Callum's trembling hands, the golden handle catching the light in a way that made the entire room hold its breath. Ilara turned toward him, confusion and terror written across her face. But before she could move, he lunged forward. The blade struck her chest with brutal force, the sound of the impact silencing even the gasps. Blood blossomed across her silk gown, red spreading like fire through ivory. She staggered, her bouquet slipping from her hands as the petals scattered across the polished floor. The music halted, the chatter ceased, and a scream erupted from somewhere in the crowd as realization dawned. The perfect wedding had become a scene of horror in a single, violent motion. Guests surged back, chairs clattering as people scrambled for the exits. Some tried to intervene, but Callum stood frozen over his bride, the dagger still in his grip, his expression twisted with shock at his own actions. Vivian, who had orchestrated the exposure, stared in horror, her face drained of all satisfaction. She had intended humiliation, not murder. But her obsession had lit the spark that consumed them all. Ilara collapsed to the floor, her breathing shallow, her gown soaked in crimson. The once beautiful image of a bride now lay broken and lifeless on the cold marble. Her eyes stared upward, glassy and unseeing, while her veil tangled beneath her. Guests wept, shouted, and rushed toward the exits as the ballroom descended into complete panic. Phones captured everything, turning the tragedy into an instant spectacle for the outside world. Security stormed the hall, restraining Callum as he resisted, his knuckles white around the dagger. He shouted incoherently, but the words were drowned in the chaos. Vivian was pulled aside, trembling, unable to comprehend the scale of what she had unleashed. Dr. Crane stood rigid, her professional detachment shattered by the brutality she had just witnessed. In minutes, the grand celebration had been transformed into a crime scene. The flowers wilted beneath the weight of blood, the chandeliers glistened mockingly above the devastation, and the echoes of screams replaced the once celebratory applause. What had begun as a display of wealth and love now lay in ruins, with Alara Mayant's body at the center of the tragedy. The wedding that had promised unity and tradition had become one of the most shocking murders London's high society had ever witnessed. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and music, was now drenched in horror. Police sirens pierced the night as flashing lights painted the Grand Hotel's exterior in red and blue. Inside, detectives moved swiftly, sealing off the crime scene with yellow tape, while uniformed officers guided terrified guests into waiting rooms for questioning. The tables remained untouched, glasses of champagne still half full, plates abandoned mid-meal. In the center of it all lay the body of Alara Mayant, draped in her blood-soaked gown. A grim reminder that the fairy tale wedding had ended in unimaginable violence. Detective Rowan Pike, a seasoned investigator known for his methodical approach, took charge of the case. He observed everything: the dagger clutched in Callum's hands, the trail of petals stained with blood, the shaken faces of guests who had seen the murder unfold. It was rare for a killing of this magnitude to occur so publicly, with hundreds of witnesses and cameras recording from every angle. To Pike, the challenge was not in proving who had committed the crime, but in understanding how a wedding had descended into such horror. Callum Havers was arrested on the spot. He did not resist when officers pried the weapon from his grip, though his face was a mask of anguish and fury. His white suit was splattered with crimson, his hands trembling as he muttered incoherent words about betrayal and humiliation. For many in attendance, it was not just the murder that shocked them, but the sight of a groom transformed into a killer before their very eyes. Guests who had once admired him now recoiled, their memories forever scarred by the violence they had witnessed. Vivian Havers, who had set the chain of events into motion, was quickly pulled into the investigation. Detectives questioned her in a private room, piecing together her role in the exposure of the forged certificate. She admitted to hiring Dr. Isolde Crane and to orchestrating the public revelation, but insisted she had never intended for her brother to resort to murder. Still, Pike noted her lack of remorse, her obsession with her family's reputation overshadowing any grief for the dead bride. Though she did not wield the dagger, her actions had been the spark that ignited the tragedy, and the law would not ignore that. Dr. Crane provided a clinical but crucial account of her involvement. She explained how she had uncovered the forgery, her professional duty leaving her no choice but to confirm the findings when asked. Her testimony painted a picture of a family consumed by pride and appearances, a household where tradition was weaponized against those who entered it. The doctor, shaken by the spectacle, admitted she had never anticipated her role in a murder investigation. The case became a media storm almost immediately. Headlines screamed across newspapers in both the UK and Malaysia, dubbing the event the Virginity wedding murder. Videos recorded by guests circulated online, showing Callum's attack in horrifying clarity. Public outrage grew as debates erupted about outdated traditions, cultural clashes, and the toxic obsession with honor. Alara's name became synonymous with the scandal, her tragic death overshadowed by the lies that had led to it. In court, Callum's defense argued that he had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage, humiliated before his family and peers. But the prosecution painted a darker picture: a man whose pride and ego had turned violent, destroying not only his bride but also his family's reputation. Witness after witness testified to the events of that night, their voices trembling as they recalled the blood, the screams, and the chaos that followed. Ultimately, Callum was sentenced to life in prison. Vivian, though spared the same fate, faced charges of conspiracy and incitement, her social standing permanently destroyed. Dr. Crane's name was cleared, though she withdrew from her private practice, unable to shake the image of a bride dying in front of her. The Havers family, once admired for their wealth and influence, was left broken and disgraced. Alara Mayant's body was flown back to Kuala Lumpur, where her family buried her quietly, far from the spectacle that had consumed her final moments. She was remembered by those who loved her not for the forged certificate, but for the young woman she had been: hopeful, vulnerable, and caught in the ruthless grip of pride and tradition. The case lingered in public memory as a chilling reminder that beneath the glamour of weddings and the weight of family honor, darkness can thrive. What should have been a celebration of love became a lesson carved in blood. When secrets, control, and obsession collide, the cost can be fatal.